Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me thank our sponsors and organizers and hosts. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for holding this forum. It is a real delight to me to be in a room full of people who would like to talk about James Monroe. And I am delighted to find at least one other person who likes to talk about the painting of Monroe crossing the Delaware. Long may it continue. I am known for one of my taglines, where if you stand still, I will tell you about James Monroe. So here we all are, and I'm glad you're sitting still. Let me tell you about James Monroe. That is my current mission. And I've been telling people about James Monroe for just about a year. And I'd like to acknowledge Carolyn Holmes is here, and I'm so pleased about that. Carolyn was the longtime director of Lawn-Highland. And so what we're working on now builds on her foundation, especially her foundation of restoration of the property. And so we're grateful for that and glad Carolyn's still here and interested. So thank you. Lawn-Highland and Highland. You hear us using those two names. Highland, in fact, was the home of James Monroe. It was his Highland plantation, as he called it. Highland near Milton, he sometimes put on the top of his letters. In fact, it was his second home, his second property in Albemarle County. He moved to Albemarle County to be near his friend and mentor, Thomas Jefferson, whose adjacent Monticello property shared a boundary with Highland. Monroe's first property in Albemarle was on land now occupied by the University of Virginia. That was about 800 acres. And then he moved to Highland, purchasing the property in 1793, moving there in November of 1799. And it was a little further up, nestled into the ridge, and that, in fact, I assume is why he called it Highland, or sometimes my Highland Plantation. Okay? It was the home of James and Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe throughout a long period of Monroe's public service until 1823, and it was finally sold in several parcels starting in 1826, at which point his permanent residence, his primary residence was Oak Hill in Loudoun County. So the property itself currently is about 535 acres. There's a historic core that's interpreted. You can see the service yard going off to the side. And the house itself is an oddly small house. Charming and quite cozy, I think, is what a realtor today would call it. And it is, in a very interesting way, thinking of Monroe's plans for himself and his future, and then his ultimate plans at Oak Hill. It's a two-room center chimney building, so it's a 2-over-2. It has a basement that's accessible from the other side. And then there is a one-room, a 1-over-1 addition just off the slide to the left, and then there is a shed addition in one or more operations on the north side, which we're seeing here. So Highland was Monroe's name for it, but after Monroe, there were other owners, and that's where the Ash Lawn part comes in. And so Ash Lawn is the later name. When we talk about the property in its historic sense, we tend to say Highland. It may eventually be our name again. Carolyn had the foresight of adding back the Highland. I think when you started there, Carolyn, it was just Ash Lawn, and you added the Highland part, so we're Ash Lawn Highland. And we may come out the other side of that eventually and return to the historic name. One of the reasons the Highland part is so significant, in fact, is that the little white building that you saw was, in fact, rather overshadowed when this now yellow house was constructed around 1880. And so this 1880-ish structure is a 2-story, big, great Victorian-style building that tends to put a different perspective on Monroe and his time at Lawn-Highland, or at Highland, as I would say. Okay, so here's the picture of the two houses together, so you can see that they adjoin inside. And in an effort to put the focus on Monroe and an understanding of his building here, we have moved the tours from entering that yellow front door to that yellow house that you just saw, and now we come around and enter the north side there. Okay, so you see a tour going into that north front door. And our tours are the centerpiece of the historic site visit. I'll talk a little bit more about the other parts of the site visit, but the tour is the main place we have active interpretation and where we really are allowed to tell people our narrative. So that's where we collectively tell you about James Monroe. Okay, so to focus on Monroe, I'm really glad to have Brooke's conversation this morning. And I know that I'm going to have him tell me a lot more about Monroe going forward. Because focusing a single clear message on a topic or small set of topics about Monroe isn't the easiest thing in the world. There's a long, long career in public service. Okay? 5 decades in public service in one way or another means that this man was involved with lots of pivotal moments of U.S. history. And to me, the best thing that we can do to highlight Monroe and be effective teachers about him is to be effective teachers about his time and place and this context in American history. So let's look at the basics of what we would say in a house tour. Let's go with the Monroe facts right now. Probably most of us know biography. In case there's a few here who don't, bear with me. The dates and locations. Monroe, of course, was born in 1758 in Westmoreland County. Okay? His family of origin. His parents were planters. I understand that they were on the modest end of comfortable. Okay? They did hold land. They did hold slaves. They did send Monroe to Campbelltown Academy, the Reverend Archibald Campbell's school, where he studied a typical elite education, known for going to class with someone he paralleled throughout his career, the future Chief Justice John Marshall. Okay? His family of procreation, of course, he married Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe, the beauty from New York, well-educated, speaking French in her own right, and having adventures with him there in France. And they had 2 daughters who lived to adulthood, and a son who died in early childhood. Okay? Beyond Campbelltown Academy, Monroe, under the tutelage or under the patronage of his uncle, Judge Joseph Jones, went to the College of William and Mary. By the time Monroe was 16, both his parents had died, and he went on to the college to study there. From where he was swept off into the American Revolution, okay? Taking up arms and fighting for the cause that he later came to believe in so strongly. We can, of course, talk about his public offices with these string of elected positions that he held, of course, culminating in a 2-term presidency, but multiple terms as governor, all kinds of representation, Secretary of State, Secretary of War. More political offices than any president before or since. Okay? A really remarkable career. And then getting back to the political events. To be effective teachers, we talk about the time and place. What did Monroe contribute to? What was he a part of? Okay? And this is kind of where we're leading with our interpretation. And of course, there's the decorative arts. We have a significant collection, and it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the James Monroe Museum here, because many of our fine pieces are on loan from our colleagues there, as well as a collection that we own. So there are Monroe items and family pieces. There are items similar to Monroe pieces to tell the full story while the originals are elsewhere. And of course, there's the decoration of the house in period style. So we also have a physical structure and very rich contents here. Okay, so how do we put that together? How do you reach in there and say something that is the most significant thing you can say about James Monroe? How can you make Highland as relevant as it can be? Well, let's look at the compelling difference. It's this small structure. What did our real estate agent say? Cozy and charming, right? But it's home to a sitting president. Okay, so that's where we need to start really, and it comes really back to Monroe's legacy. What is his significance? How do we remember him? How should we remember him? How does history mark his importance? And that's where we're headed with our current interpretation. I show you an example here of a very interesting attempt to show the twists and turns in the development of the American political parties. Mostly it's for fun because I love this graphic, but to show you how I'm thinking about portraying a series of events is not always easy. It's not always linear. Making it linear sometimes is crazy and fun, but it's not really easy. Let's think about how do we define for a public audience Monroe's accomplishments and his involvement in events that shaped U.S. history. Because it's his presence there and his participation in these events in American history that make his lifetime of accomplishments so interesting. So we've got his participation in the American Revolution, fought as a teenager, negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, multiple ministries to France, presence in Britain and Spain, Gabriel's Rebellion as governor, the Missouri Compromise, perhaps saving us from the Civil War too early, the future of slavery. What a big question that is. The Monroe Doctrine, the road and canal systems, essential. The War of 1812, a significant role there, both before and during, support for the standing military and the National Bank, and of course the negotiation of fixed borders. All of these are things that we could talk about to discuss Monroe and his importance, to be teachers about him and his time period. How do we do that? You think that if we just spouted all those, that would be a good story? Part of it is the construction of a narrative. Here's how I think about it. 3 overlapping themes, okay? U.S. relationships with mature European powers, okay? National growth and expansion, and the preservation of a young nation. All right? And these are not probably all-encompassing. They may not be the final version of what we're teaching, but for now, this is what we're looking at. The U.S. relationships with mature European powers, we talked about that just a little bit in our first discussion this morning. This triangular relationship between France, Britain, and the U.S. That was really a defining characteristic of these first decades of the American Republic. And Monroe is there in a lot of different ways. National growth and expansion. I think Monroe saw the importance of the West. I think that's clear in a lot of ways. From navigation rights on the Mississippi through those western borders, through how to manage that expansion with the Missouri Compromise. Okay. The preservation of the young nation. This is sort of a soft category, but I see a commitment there to navigating those bumps. The success of this experiment in governance was not guaranteed. Okay? There were many points in early American history when it could have gone badly off the rails. Okay? Monroe didn't single-handedly, like Superman, keep it together. But he was there at a lot of those critical junctures, making decisions and influencing people to agree on things that really changed, perhaps subtly, but perhaps sort of like the butterfly flapping his wings in Tokyo, having ripples that affected the larger world. He really participated and contributed to this preservation of the young nation. I see it as having an overarching ideal, and I'm glad that we overlap on this, in a commitment to the ideals of the American Republic. This experiment in governance, this modern democracy. Monroe was convinced that this was the answer. This was a higher ideal than political parties. It was a higher ideal than probably even political favor. It was worth fighting for and nearly dying for. It was worth compromising for. So I see that as sort of the umbrella that he worked towards. And I don't know if he got up in the morning and said, what can I do today to preserve the American Republic? But if you look back at the end of his life, he probably could look back and say, I did this, this, and this, and this in order to do that. Okay? So, all right, you're on a house tour. And your guide's telling you these abstract themes. All right? How do you do that? Okay? Well, you can pepper your thought process with all of these events and participations that we listed earlier. And they're overlapping, aren't they? You can't just put each of these in one category. So how do we do that? Well, we have our interpretive staff talk about these events and these points of participation, and then bring them back up to the themes. And you can see how they overlap. So these U.S. relationships with mature European powers. Of course, it starts with the American Revolution in Monroe's experience, right? Actually, it probably starts with his father's views on the eventual revolution. But, of course, the Louisiana Purchase, the War of 1812. I could have put in Florida here. I love talking about the acquisition of Florida. The Monroe Doctrine, of course, the standing military support for it, and the National Bank, of course. Well, that's not a party line, is it, for him? The negotiation of fixed borders, this question of slavery. And he saw that as a potential national security threat and a moment of international crisis. And of course, his ambassadorships. We can do the same things for each of the other themes. This idea of national growth and expansion. Okay? And this is, looking at these pieces is how I think Monroe did, in fact, see the importance of the expanding West. And I don't imagine necessarily that he had a predetermined sense of the continental scope of the U.S. But I'd be willing to talk about that and what he did see in terms of the eventual limits of westward expansion. We know that he worked hard to make expansion successful. Of course, had he not sort of shepherded the nation into the Monroe Doctrine, what if the Civil War had occurred 40 years earlier? Were the systems in place for eventual Union success? I'm gonna put a no out there as a point of conversation, okay? A significant point, Missouri Compromise, significant point in really seeing us through one of those bumps, one of the sets of rapids that the young U.S. navigated. Okay? And then my soft category of preservation, a lot of these same things, a lot of the potential crises, some of which the founders all saw, especially even the senior founders, such as slavery. They knew that was looming. They knew that was looming from the very beginning. So Monroe was there kind of ushering in the period of adolescence of the U.S. I'm interested in his presidency. Let's look at his presidency. When he falls into that line of presidents, he is sort of a cusp point. Maybe not quite so much as John Quincy Adams or even Jackson, but he's really heading away from that original group. As number 5, his point in history and the place of his presidency is something of great interest. I think we could talk about in this context. So all in all, we have these themes, and they're supported by events and facts and parts of interpretation. And they all fit under this umbrella of essentially Monroe's big thing was this commitment to these ideals of the American Republic. And we do this in the spaces in the house. telling stories and supporting the narrative by the objects and the spaces. Furniture, for example, that reflects Monroe's time abroad, or tastes that reflect his American origins and so forth. And so we can really weave the narrative into the space and use the collection to help tell it. Okay. There's also the outside spaces. And there are dependency spaces, kitchen spaces under the main house. This is the back view, that yard, the service yard that you saw around to the right of that first image of the house. And of course you get the yellow house and the white house, thankfully in these colors, so we can refer to them in shorthand, the Monroe period structure and the later structure. And so our interpreting these spaces is also a part of the story. And we are, at this point, telling something about the spaces themselves and something about the enslaved people and the non-elite folks who worked in and around them. And this is part of the ongoing work here to bring out previous research, many research reports that we have with rich information that we'll be putting into play in these spaces in particular. Things like the reconstructed and restored buildings, you see some of both here. And what do we know about those, and how can we have those support Monroe's, the greater picture about Monroe in our spaces. We do some costumed interpretation, and again, how does that fit the main themes of Monroe's accomplishments and his contributions to American history? And these are still things that, as always, are and will be evolving. Okay, just showing you what else we're doing to interpret James Monroe. This is our new website, launched earlier this month. And here we are, not a vast amount of new content, but very much a new platform and a new way of reaching out to people. Just a couple images from here to show you. This one I chose in particular to remind me to tell you about our workshops. We do school group workshops, in particular any group of learners of various ages that are both craft-oriented, experiential, and lesson-based on themes that support our understanding of Monroe. Okay, so Lawn-Highland is in Charlottesville. James Monroe's Highland is another name for it. And this is what we're doing to interpret a man who has remained elusive in some senses, or whose legacy has been somewhat undefined. And so, all right, thank you for having me talk to you, and I turn it over to Scott.
Well, I think Sarah just about covered it, so thank you. It is remarkable. We had a couple of little conversations about how we would approach the subject matter, but in fact, we didn't really have an exact idea of what the other was going to say. And what's very gratifying to me is that while there'll be a little bit of restatement, as you would expect, because we're dealing with the same basic subject matter, the ways in which we approach the story are a little different, a little site-specific and context-specific, but they mesh extremely well, and we look forward to that institutional harmony, that era of good feelings that will come forward. We had to throw it in there somewhere. Nobody used it yet. Wow, 2 hours into the thing. So what we'll talk about at the James Monroe Museum is our evolution in terms of our site history and how we came to be and how we've evolved. And again, what those messages are, finding that essential story or stories to tell about James Monroe. And I've used the title at the top there before in talking about it, because I think Monroe's life really is an example of service above self. So many times when he needed to be concentrating on his law practice or getting a farm to actually be prosperous, he would be called away. He'd be called like Cincinnatus from the plow, almost literally, to go back and take a diplomatic post, to assume a public office, to fulfill some public service. really at the cost of his own personal economy. The man was arguing with the federal government practically to his death about getting reimbursed for expenses going back forever. And, wow, imagine that, having trouble getting a federal government to be responsive. Sorry, cheap line there for that. The James Monroe Museum and Memorial Library was very much begun as a family affair. In 1927, Rose DeSheen Gouverneur Hughes and her son, Lawrence Gouverneur Hughes, saved a building at 908 Charles Street in Fredericksburg, Virginia, from demolition. The threat came, ironically, from the adjacent James Monroe service station, which had wanted to expand. Instead, the Hughes established a museum depicting James Monroe's law office and library during his years in Fredericksburg in the 1780s. Lawrence Hughes, who was the museum's director for 51 years, let me say that again, 51 years, augmented the family heirlooms that they brought to the museum with an insatiable collecting effort to assemble the largest repository of Monroe-related artifacts, books, and archives in the world. And Lawrence was a consummate showman. I did not have the privilege of knowing him. His widow, Camilla Hughes Pope, is with us today, and so if you want to know about Lawrence the man, we have the person who can tell you the most about him. He was a promoter in the most positive sense of the word for getting the Monroe message out. Sara and I could learn something about his indefatigable effort to tell the world about James Monroe. In 1948, the James Monroe Memorial Foundation was created to administer the site, and the foundation transferred ownership of the museum and its collection to the Commonwealth of Virginia in 1964. The University of Virginia was the initial administrative authority until 1972, when UVA's Women's Division, Mary Washington College, assumed responsibility at the time of it becoming an independent school. Today, the museum is governed by the Board of Visitors of the University of Mary Washington, and a Board of Regents appointed by the Governor of Virginia and consisting of UMW and James Monroe Memorial Foundation representatives serves as the museum's advisory board. And in about half an hour, they'll be meeting on the other side of that wall. So, as we evolved from the founding of the museum, its initial interpretation as the law office of James Monroe, through the decades, as the institution grew, as the relationship with what's now the University of Mary Washington evolved, there was an evolution in the approach of how to interpret the site. In the 1980s, analysis and research of the building confirmed that the museum building is actually 3 buildings that were constructed at different times in the 19th century, and none of them were present when James Monroe owned the property. He had owned this property in the 1780s, and the idea of his law practice being there was certainly a valid thought, a valid possibility. But we knew by the 1980s it was not in the structure in which the museum is located. So rather than continue the interpretation of a recreated law office, the decision was made in 2007 to modify the interior space of the museum, to go to a presentation based on galleries and on the topics that were felt to be representative of the major themes of Monroe's life. So like Sara, like Lawn-Highland, we've taken a look at the whole life of Monroe and how to define these various areas. And this really, for us, is still an ongoing exercise, as it is for Lawn-Highland. We particularly focus on the experience of the American Revolution as being something that was a great animating principle for Monroe's life, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then the other aspects, major aspects of his career, are how we approach that. Well, these changes has also come a renewed emphasis on the museum's mission and on its relationship to the mission of the University of Mary Washington. Let me share our mission statement, which gives the best expression of what we do. James Monroe Museum and Memorial Library is dedicated to the study, interpretation, and presentation of the life and times of the 5th President of the United States. Its mission is also to trace the social, political, and intellectual influence of James Monroe and to present it within the context of his life through exhibitions, publications, scholarly presentations, community events, and educational programs. As administrative unit of the University of Mary Washington, the museum contributes to a superior educational environment by serving as a cultural and professional resource for students, faculty, and staff, reflecting the university's mission and the personal values of James Monroe. The museum supports adaptive learning, personal achievement, responsible leadership, service to others, and engaged citizenship in a global and diverse society. And I will tell you that most of that second paragraph is lifted directly from the university's own mission, but the applicability to James Monroe's life and example could not be better. The fact that we are within the context of a higher educational institution that supports these values and that they so clearly reflect the values of Monroe's career make for a very good combination.
It should be James Monroe University.
You know, it's been brought up in the past. Yeah, Madison's got one, you know. As Sara observed, when you sign on to talk about James Monroe, you've got a lot to consider. First, there is the amazing number of diverse historical figures with whom he interacted, some of whom were friends, some of whom were adversaries. So we got all the baseball cards here for all the players. Collect them all, trade them with your friends. He was also, of course, a loving husband and father who maintained the closest of family relationships throughout an active career in public service. And I threw the dress in just to balance those, but it's reflective of Mrs. Monroe and the children being very much a part of the story we tell, as well as the husband and father. He was a bona fide war hero who held the flag behind George Washington as they were rowed across the freezing Delaware, standing up
Of course.
to surprise the Hessian detachment of Trenton. Except, as we know, it didn't happen. It didn't happen that way. Monroe was doing what we could almost call, not special ops exactly, but he was with the advance force. He and really a scratch pickup company were already across the river. Had the foresight to pick up a doctor along the way whose farm they stumbled across, and that man would save his life after the Battle of Trenton. And yes, so far we're still hitting the imagery of the painting here. What I love is that everyone in this boat is representative of someone who contributed to the American Revolution, or some group of people. They aren't identified figures, but two of them are, George Washington and James Monroe. They're the two that are identified as the individuals present. The rest of them are all sort of representatives of the sort of people involved. So I thought that was significant. But what is true about this episode is that James Monroe carried the ideals of the American Revolution in his heart and a Hessian musket ball in his shoulder for the rest of his life. His diplomatic career, as we've said, took him to Great Britain, to Spain, to France. Oh, sorry. Jump ahead there. Where he witnessed the French Revolution and later the coronation of Napoleon. And he and Elizabeth, I want to emphasize, Mrs. Monroe and the children went with him. This is not a case of Benjamin Franklin leaving his family behind for 25 years while he's in England. The Monroes traveled as a unit. You got the whole package. So he was there, they were there for these events of the carrying on of this revolutionary spirit and the excesses that occurred, and then the consolidation of a monarchical power, an empire really under Napoleon. And yet he's also there to help close the deal on the Louisiana Purchase. I have said, not totally really in jest, that if you remember the movie Zelig, or if you saw Forrest Gump, it's James Monroe's got that impact on history. He's in the room in almost every scene of our early national history. He's there somewhere in the frame. Sometimes in the background, sometimes in the foreground. As we said, he was elected governor of Virginia 4 times, overseeing construction of the state's first penitentiary, the first manufactory of arms. He suppressed Gabriel's rebellion and enhanced the executive authority of the Virginia governor in the process of doing so. And he signed the legislation to build the governor's mansion. Never got to live there, but he signed the legislation to build it, and his portrait from our collection is currently on loan there. And in Madison's administration, carrying out the role of Secretary of State, and after the British raid on Washington, which he had warned to be better prepared for that and wasn't listened to, he simultaneously took on the role of Secretary of War. One of very few people in our country's history to hold more than one cabinet office at the same time. It's happened once or twice elsewhere, but no one, I think, brought as much gravitas toward this function as Monroe did at this time. And for the sake of brevity, I have skipped over a few things. Legislator, senator, state legislator, there is so much to try and encompass. And during his presidency, from 1817 to 1825, the Monroes refurnished the White House in a style that later First Families sought to emulate. Theodore Roosevelt tried, certainly Jackie Kennedy, in her significant restoration of the White House, specifically wanted to recapture the Monroe look, the Monroe era, as the true definition of White House style. And that has even continued in subsequent administrations. And as Sara particularly pointed out, and they had a wonderful lecture about this at Lawn-Highland that we took a busload of our museum people to see not long ago, Monroe signed the Missouri Compromise in the hope of avoiding the Civil War. Yet he nonetheless, like his friend and mentor Jefferson, shared the foreboding of what this could mean. Jefferson called the circumstances of the Missouri Compromise and this clash over the extension of slavery a fire bell in the night. And he was much more pessimistic about what the future would hold than at least Monroe ever put down. Monroe tended to keep a more positive feeling about what may happen. But they both recognized that this is the really significant manifestation of this fundamental conflict that would come to dominate the rest of the middle part of the 19th century, this issue over slavery, its expansion, and what it meant to the Union. So again, Monroe is there, from the Revolution to the eve of the Civil War. And of course, he promulgated the Monroe Doctrine. And I don't care if John Quincy Adams wrote 90% of it. I don't care if he wrote 10% of it. It's not the Adams Doctrine. It's the Monroe Doctrine. Thank you. And it has been one of the more durable and influential elements of our foreign policy, even into the 21st century. It's been folded and spindled and mutilated by almost anyone who's invoked it since 1823. But you can't deny that whatever its impact today, and we'll hear more about that, whatever it really represented, very few foreign policy statements or anything that a president says tends to last, well into a second or a third century from when it was done. And I think it's a pretty good testament to the impact that the doctrine has had all these years, that we're still talking about it so long after James Monroe put it forward. So how do we do this job? How do we, like Sara said, come about to tell the story of James Monroe, his accomplishments, his family, his life? Well, we start, as already noted, with an exceptional collection of artifacts and documents, the tangible reminders of his legacy. We offer public programs on a variety of topics, from scholarly lectures to cultural festivals to decorative arts workshops. And we seek to engage children particularly. We're doing more and more of that through educational programs that make learning fun. And at least from this last one, Major Monroe's History Camp, we know it's fun because they told us so in the surveys, that the kids had a wonderful time. I love the picture, the lower right there, of hanging on the wall, watching the musket firing that was going on. This kind of programming, both for summer groups like this, plus outreach within the area schools, is something we want to definitely do more of, because we face a real issue with the teaching of American history in our schools these days. It is mile wide and an inch deep in a lot of cases, in my opinion, and where we can augment that, especially for younger children, to try to get them to actually find history interesting and fun, is a real noble effort. It is a noble effort. I think it's something we should try to do. We're also, though, a learning lab for UMW students in history, historic preservation, and museum studies. We have a wonderful program here that's got a long lineage of training people to be the stewards of our heritage in the future. And we're fortunate to be a part of that. And I swear UMW has male students. I could not find an image that had a male student in it, but I've seen them. They are there. I was one of them, so they are here. But we have had, among other kinds of interns and class participation, Christina Turdine's Museum Studies class comes every year. They were just there a few weeks ago. We have 2 students every year who work in the museum under a scholarship called the Boley Scholarship. And they spend the entire year working every week with us, and we try to give them as much variety of experience as possible. It's not just grunt work, although there's some of that. but we try to involve them in exhibits and programs. The Bowleys are helping us with the presentation of the symposium over the weekend. And I can say very proudly that quite a number of the people who've gone through, gotten their degree in historic preservation or history from here, and have been Bowley scholars at our museum, have gone on to very responsible positions at other museums around the country. Curators, educators, directors. So we feel we are really helping fulfill that part of our professional responsibility and our UMW institutional mission in being that learning lab for museum professionals. The garden of the museum provides a venue for special events and rentals that has helped spread our message. It's a part, in a way, of our educational and marketing arm, and it also helps us funding our operations. Just the last couple of years alone, the last 2 fiscal years, our rental income has grown 74% from the kind of uses that we've been able to put the garden to. And as we look ahead, well, I turned over one page too many, excuse me. We also have embarked on a variety of marketing initiatives and promotional partnerships that are fundamentally based on raising awareness of James Monroe and of our museum and our role in interpreting that legacy. And my motto has sort of been, you know, I'll talk about partnering with almost anybody to figure out a way to get that Monroe message. It's my version of the "if you will stand still, I'll tell you about Monroe." I guess mine is, if you will stand with me, we'll both talk about Monroe and whatever you want to talk about, whether it's the Civil War, whether it is working to honor our veterans and their military families through the Blue Star program, the War of 1812 commemoration. The Rappahannock Time Traveler is sort of a local program we've done with Stafford County Tourism to help promote multiple site visits. That's Buzzy, the B105 FM radio bead up there next to James Monroe. And yes, that's me in the background doing my chimney sweep interpretation. And then Dan and myself on C-SPAN most recently as part of the Fredericksburg Cities tour. All of these are ways, all these are vehicles to try and get that Monroe awareness out there. Looking ahead to possible future. The current UMW dining facility, which some of you will go to today, or perhaps you have before, Seekebeck Hall, is being replaced. Those of you who know the campus and haven't been here in a while have been asking, where'd Chandler Hall go? Well, that's going to be the site of a new student center, which will encompass a dining facility. And Seekebeck Hall, which was originally slated for demolition, has been saved, but there has been no identified specific use of it put forward yet. And so under the Dean of Students, Dean Finkelstein, and with some other department heads, the museum and I worked on a task force to talk about potential use of the dining hall as a museum and arts center for the university. This would potentially benefit not only the James Monroe Museum and our efforts, but also the UMW galleries and some of the other cultural entities within the campus to give us exhibit and event and support space that in pretty much every case we don't currently have. We are limited only really by the physical extent of the facilities we have to work with. So perhaps, if I can get through that, in some future day, we hope not too far in the future, dining halls could become exhibit halls. And a kitchen, a big, cavernous, wonderful kitchen, might be a big, cavernous, wonderful auditorium. Instead of canned food in the basement, could one day be a state-of-the-art collection storage area. And the elegant dome room could be a showcase for a museum store. That's a very expensive dream, by the way, and we'll see if we get a chance to fulfill it. They're going to have to do something. The building isn't being torn down. Whatever the future does hold, though, the James Monroe Museum will stay true to its mission and to the legacy of its namesake. And as I said, in very grateful partnership with Lawn-Highland, with the James Monroe Memorial Foundation, with the university, with all those who are interested in putting forward the message of James Monroe, we are proud to be a part of that and look forward to greater possibilities ahead. Thank you. And I guess we'll take questions if we dare. Got a few minutes?
I'd like to be clear on when he left Highland and came to Lawn. I was overseas a lot, but I
Right, there,
didn't kind of,
Can you repeat
didn't
the
catch
question?
two houses at once, in other words.
right, so the question was about the timing of Monroe's leaving Highland and moving to Oak Hill, and how that happened with two houses at once. By 1817 or so, Monroe was building the house he always intended to build, and it was at Oak Hill in Loudoun County. However, the official residence of Mr. and Mrs. Monroe was Highland until 1823. Okay, so in his later years, in the later years even of his occupancy of Highland, he was spending more and more time closer to Washington, D.C. At Highland. So there was an overlap, and he was at Oak Hill, I beg your pardon, there was an overlap, but the end of the official residence was 23, and his attentions were in both places for a few years before that. Yes.
He was not a signer of the Declaration of Independence because he was too young.
He was a young teen at that point.
But I noticed he's not a signer of the Constitution. So where was he when he was 31?
He was in the convention, the Virginia ratifying convention of the Constitution, and he was initially opposed to it, at least in part on the grounds of not having a Bill of Rights. And he was very much in line with George Mason and Patrick Henry in that regard, but was a staunch supporter of it once the Bill of Rights was incorporated. But again, he's coming right at the younger side of that generation.
And I've, in fact, in working through, the Monroe legacy, I have asked myself, is it really correct that we call him a founding father, of course, famously called the last of the founding fathers? Is that really correct? He was too young to be a signer. He didn't dream up the revolution the way some of the original guys did. But then I tell myself, he was really instrumental in the way the Constitution turned out eventually. He was so opposed to the lack of Bill of Rights that his force, not at all really like Patrick Henry's force, because they were very different in character, really had an impact there. And his ability to be part of that swayed the eventual ratification, I think qualifies him as being a founding father, just from his presence there.
Well, and he's of the generation of Hamilton and of John Marshall, as we said. And John Marshall, it's always said, he was the last founding father, and the Liberty Bell cracked on the tolling for his funeral. So, I think that particularly those men who were there to earn their Republican rights by fighting for them, and then move in to be that successor generation of leaders in the early national period, I don't see how you can't consider them founding fathers, and lots of founding mothers along there too. Andrew Jackson.
I love talking about Andrew Jackson, but I can only do it over lunch because I don't know anything about him. I just love talking about him.
Well, a friend of mine's director of the Hermitage, and I like that we have a good-natured rivalry about whether Jackson's really the last of the founding fathers to be president. So he's a kid.
Was he like a 13 or 14?
He was like 13.
Yeah,
Was uppity to a British officer and got smacked around for it. I don't think that qualifies.
Yeah, we can talk about
with
Jackson.
Trenton, yeah.
Yes, sir.
What led him to Charlottesville?
Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson wanted him to be near there. Of course, his first marital home was here in Fredericksburg. Jefferson wanted to create a society to our taste. He had Madison in Orange and wanted Monroe to be close. And so it was really at the beckoning of Jefferson that Monroe moved to Albemarle County. And I see in his later, well, not very latest, but in the letters at some point when he had both properties up for sale, I see him as somewhat conflicted. He really was trending towards Oak Hill at that point, faced a significant amount of personal debt, and he wrote to Jefferson, I've put both properties up for sale, and whichever one sells first will be the one to go. And he tells Jefferson, and I do hope that I can keep the Albemarle one. Whether he's being kind to his friend and mentor and expressing the appreciation of their being there together, I don't know. But I do know that he had just built a grand house that he always wanted in Loudoun County. So there you go.
Did
Yes.
he work as assistant to Jefferson?
He read the law under Jefferson.
Right.
When he came back from the Revolution, He really had to sit down with himself and decide what he wanted to do. Did he want to go back and resume his studies at William and Mary, or did he want to accept then Governor Jefferson's invitation to read the law with Jefferson?
I understand that, but I didn't know if he had some integral part in assisting with certain things, Jefferson with certain.
Well, he was appointed, Jefferson did appoint him ambassador to France for what ended up being the negotiation of the Louisiana Purchase Treaty.
Right.
Initially, it was more strictly confined to New Orleans and understanding of access to that. But when the opportunity presented itself to get the whole enchilada, he was there to help close that. And it's interesting because Robert Livingston was already there, and Monroe gets sent over to sort of join in that, and he was very sensitive to not stepping on Livingston's toes, just as Monroe himself had been saddled with some additional help when he had been an ambassador. So he even then was practicing that sense of trying to work to a harmonious outcome. But, and of course, unfortunately, Jefferson felt the treaty that would come later. The Louisiana thing's fine, but the later treaty that came out of Monroe's efforts with Britain was not deemed acceptable. So there was some estrangement there really after that.
And Brooke, did you want to add to that?
Oh, I was just going to say he briefly served in a military capacity for Jefferson when he was young.
He was an observer, yeah.
A militia?
As a
Type of
scout,
militia?
scout during when the British were invaded. We're in Virginia.
He had gotten his colonel's commission in the Virginia line, and in that capacity, yes, was an observer for Jefferson, but could not get a field command together. He saw he didn't have a future left in the Army at that point, and so turned to the law and politics. I saw a hand way back there. Sorry.
Yeah, in my museum studies classes, I assigned some readings that describe the museum world as a whole with two halves. And on one side, there are curators like you who read entire libraries on the subject, where they interpret for the public, and they work long days and nights to craft, an interpretation that is really accurate and reflective of the historical truth. And the other half is the visitors, and sometimes, they come with their own agenda. They have their own interpretation of history, more or less accurate. They hold on their, their prejudices in some cases. So I was wondering, it's not a mean group of people by definition, it's just that it's hard to get a message across. And I was wondering whether for your museums, if you get a sense that the visitors get what you want them to.
How many people have asked you about what his wife Dolly did during the war?
Well, I see what we do at Highland ultimately as being effective teachers. And being an effective teacher sometimes means having to draw on a well of patience and being willing to reiterate and recast and help people to fit what they're learning into their own worldview. And that's the best version of it. But yes, sometimes people want to come and talk about points that really aren't your chosen narrative, or points that confront things you're presenting. But ultimately, in an ideal world, it's that role as teacher, as educator, where you reach in and you say, okay, let me help you look at it this way. And to endlessly recast that until you find some way of enlightenment, or until they want to go pursue their intent elsewhere.
Well, I think what we find, too, that we do see that. Now, I should say some of our museum guides are in the audience, and if I'm going off on the wrong tangent, jump up and tell me. I think just fundamental awareness a lot of times is one of our first challenges. Just people not necessarily having a very clear idea of who James Monroe is when they get off the trolley or they come in. I mean, there are people who do. They come armed with a fairly good awareness, but there are just as many people who do come in half prepared or not even really very aware at all. And that's when these good folks and their colleagues have to set them right and show them the path of true enlightenment. Oh, we got them all over the place here.
When I visited, you were just beginning to build an enormous structure behind ancillary buildings. Whatever happened with that?
Which building Do you mean event barn?
Yeah.
There is a big building there that's used to support events, both public events and rental events. Is that what you?
Yeah, they didn't say what it was gonna be.
Yep.
Sarah, you had a wonderful layout of all the different aspects of Monroe's career. But there was one I noticed that was missing,
Okay,
and that was the acquisition of Florida.
right, and I did mention that, yeah.
And Florida, of course, but at that time, not our Florida, but Florida all the way over to
The
Pearl
Floridas.
River. It
The
was
Floridas.
the whole Gulf Coast there. And I think if you reflect on that, it shows that his incremental building of the nation as a continental nation,
Mhm,
all the way from Florida to Oregon.
mhm. Yes.
And so there is a vision there of what he wanted to do.
Yes, well, yeah, that's something I think I mentioned that I'm really interested in thinking about. You know, what was his perception? Did he have an idea that it would be continental, that idea of continental proportions? So I'm very interested to talk about that, and would be glad to think about that more with you. And you know, if you have things that you've read that enlighten on that topic, I would certainly be glad to hear your reading list. Yes, sir.
Would you say that was a time period where the idea of Manifest Destiny was coming out?
Well, I
The
might.
roots of it, not the wholehearted thing.
I think the roots, yeah.
There's someone in the back that can answer that, who wrote a book on it. Dr. Smith. Early Manifest Destiny.
Manifest Destiny, Gene, go.
Can you pin Manifest Destiny on Monroe's time period at least, the roots of it?
Well, I certainly think that when you look at the early 19th century, the roots of Manifest Destiny lie along the Gulf Coast of America. Spanish-controlled territory. As early as the 1790s, Jefferson is telling Washington that he wished 100,000 Americans would settle in Florida because it will give us peaceably what might otherwise cause us a war. And then during the War of 1812, there's a patriot effort, that's what they call themselves, patriots, to secure East Florida with the idea that it would become a part of the United States. And all that was really based on, in September of 1810, there was a rebellion that took place in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and it's called the Origins, of course I live in Texas, but I like to tell my friends in Texas, they created the original Lone Star Republic. Because they were a group of Americans in the Baton Rouge area. They rebelled against Spanish control. They raided the fort. They seized control. They drafted a constitution that looked eerily similar to the U.S. Constitution, and they asked for annexation. Well, Madison says about a month later, "Oh, we're not annexing Baton Rouge. It was already part of the United States." So de facto took control of it. But this whole idea of following the setting sun, always looking to the west, and what land could be taken peacefully. That's really the heart, the root of this idea of Manifest Destiny. Everyone likes to think about it occurring in the 1840s, but it's much earlier.
We have time, regrettably, for just one more, although I think Sarah may be able, but I've got to go to the meeting across, and so do several people here. So who gets it? Yes, ma'am. Yes.
So this question's for Sarah. I'm just wondering how the Yellow House fits in your interpretation scheme, and whether you see it as a way to talk about historic preservation, about stewardship.
It certainly can. Right now, the Yellow House has 2 exhibit rooms that are ways to provide passive interpretation, to display either temporary exhibits or artifacts that don't necessarily have a place within the domestic setting. So that's how they're used at the moment. But certainly there is a message there, and perhaps site-wide, to talk about the long-term modifications of existing structures, and those are really big and significant issues on the site that I think, yes, I'll stop talking about Monroe at some point and talk about a wider range of topics as well.